to carbon dioxide transport, there's a little blurb at the bottom of page 62 on hypoxia. And I want to talk about the forms of hypoxia. I forgot to do that before we left the break. So hypoxia, just as its name indicates, hypo is low and oxy refers to oxygen. All right? So hypoxia just means low oxygen somewhere. Hypoxemia, just to differentiate, is more specifically low oxygen in the blood. But I'm not going to differentiate between that. We're just going to talk about different types of hypoxia. So there are 3 listed in your lecture notes, and I'm going to add another one. We're going to start from the bottom and go up. So hypoxic hypoxia. This has to do with pulmonary ventilation, all right, and or external respiration. In other words, this is a problem with getting oxygen down into the alveoli or getting oxygen from the alveoli to the blood. So there's a problem with pulmonary ventilation. In other words, you're standing on top of Mount Everest, so you're not getting an adequate amount of oxygen molecules into your alveoli when you breathe. Or there's a problem with external respiration, which means maybe you have pneumonia and you've got fluid in your lungs. You've done something to the diffusion distance to which the gas has to cross. All right? So with hypoxic hypoxia, we have decreased amount of oxygen available to the blood. So when the blood is getting back to the lungs, when the blood is getting back to the heart, we have a low PO2. Right? So because of this, we have either a decreased alveolar PO2 and or we have a really thick respiratory membrane. But either or is going to result in a decreased arterial PO2 for hypoxic hypoxia. With the decreased PO2, what's going to happen to our percent hemoglobin saturation? It's going to decrease as well. Okay? So this is most often negated, treated by increasing our alveolar oxygen. Even if our problem is too thick of a respiratory membrane, if we supplement alveolar oxygen, if we're climbing Mount Everest, carry an oxygen tank on our back, okay? That's tough to tear, it must be really tough on my nose. Get a increased amount of oxygen available there, okay? Then we have anemic hypoxia. We've covered anemia already. So in both of these conditions, we have decreased amount of oxygen getting to the tissues. But with anemic hypoxia, that means we don't have enough hemoglobin or enough red blood cells to transport it. So we would have normal alveolar PO2. We would even have normal arterial PO2. And we would even have normal percent hemoglobin saturation. So what's the problem? We don't have enough hemoglobin. Okay? So whether it's hemorrhage, whether it's not enough vitamin B12, whether it's not enough protein to make the red blood cells, not enough iron in our red blood cells to bind the oxygen. We'll saturate what's there, we just don't have enough what's there to carry enough for the body to have adequate tissue function. Okay. Ischemic hypoxia has to do with circulation. So an old name for it is stagnant, but I think it's easier to understand if you think of it as circulatory hypoxia. All right. So my son fainting in the shower is ischemic hypoxia. All right, either because of the dilation of blood vessels or the rapid heartbeat, there wasn't enough blood being pumped from his lungs to his brain, and he lost consciousness. Okay. So this is a circulatory problem. So all of these would be normal. Even my total hemoglobin is normal. It's just that the hemoglobin containing the oxygen isn't getting to the tissue. A more severe example would be tying a tourniquet around my arm. That may not be a circulatory problem, but I block circulation, okay? Or an embolism in the lungs, blocking blood flow, or an embolism in the brain. So there's some problem that's preventing the blood that's carrying the normal amount of oxygen getting to the tissues. Narrow blood vessels, blood clots, low blood pressure, okay? Some problem with the circulatory. So normal alveolar PO2, normal arterial PO2, normal percent SAT, and normal total hemoglobin. So it's not an oxygenation problem except at the tissue level because I'm not getting the oxygen there. Okay? And then the one that I'm adding, and we've actually talked about already, this is toxic or histotoxic hypoxia. Carbon monoxide poisoning and cyanide poisoning are two examples of histotoxic anemia.
You mean hypoxia?
That's right, thank you. Histotoxic hypoxia. So with carbon monoxide poisoning, are we going to have a normal alveolar PO2? I'll write it up here so those of you in the back can see it. Carbon monoxide poisoning, are we going to have a normal PO in our PO2 in our lungs? It doesn't take very much carbon monoxide, okay? So it's not like we lowered our oxygen from 21% to 15 or something and replaced it with carbon monoxide. So with CO poisoning, we would have normal alveolar PO2. What about arterial PO2? Yes, we would have normal arterial PO2. What about venous PO2? Would we have more or less oxygen dissolved in the plasma?
Less.
Less. Okay, so we would have decreased venous PO2. We would always have less, but in the case of carbon monoxide poisoning, we'd have even more less, even less, or all right. What about hemoglobin saturation? It'd be less. And for arterial, what about venous? Higher. Does that make sense? Because it didn't come off. Normally, it would have come off at the tissues. Okay, and it would be, we would not have saturated hemoglobin in our venous blood because the oxygen would have been given off, but it's still saturated with carbon monoxide poisoning. Okay, so percent saturation of hemoglobin will be less in arterial blood and higher in venous blood. Okay, because it never came off. Hence the cherry red coloring instead of the blue cyanotic coloring. Okay, cyanide poisoning. potassium cyanide. It's the most common type. My big case study was the first case study in this semester with the biggest, longest, more involved one with the hyperprolactinemia. And in 430, the first semester course, my biggest and most involved is also in the first 3 weeks. And it's a case of potassium cyanide, well, at least it's cyanide, a dog, big dog, is eating some poisonous plants that have cyanide in them and is having some difficulty breathing. And his owner starts giving him artificial respiration, blowing into his mouth, and gets cyanide poisoning from the dog. All right? The dog dies. The owner's friend also does artificial respiration, but he doesn't get any cyanide poisoning because he has a condition known as blue blood. There's a group of individuals that have a different form of hemoglobin. They're concentrated in Kentucky, so they're known as the Kentucky blue bloods, and it doesn't mean, you know, a royalty, in which they are not affected by cyanide. But cyanide poisoning affects the mitochondria, and it prevents certain enzymes from utilizing oxygen. CO2 is produced, we'll talk about this in our last unit with the digestive system. CO2, carbon dioxide, is produced as we break down carbon molecules such as fats and carbohydrates and utilize the electron levels for energy, okay? So that releases the CO2. The electrons are transferred, this is for free, the electrons are transferred along the way, each going to a different lower energy level, and the extra energy that is released is captured and used to make ATP. And at the very lowest energy level, the electrons and hydrogens are combined with oxygen to make water. So those enzymes, not being affected by the cyanide, prevent them from interacting. Therefore, the oxygen isn't utilized. So with cyanide poisoning, the cell can't use the oxygen and dies of not lack of oxygen that's not there, just it can't use the oxygen. So when we look at cyanide poisoning, it's similar here to carbon dioxide with some key differences. So cyanide poisoning, or cyanide hypoxia, is going to have normal alveolar PO2, normal arterial PO2, but elevated venous, because the cells weren't able to take up the oxygen. So the oxygen stays in the blood. All right? So elevated venous PO2. Percent saturation of hemoglobin would be normal in arterial and elevated in venous for the same reason. So for most of these, a lot of the PO2 values are normal because the definition of the hypoxia is based on whether the tissues are actually getting the oxygen. And we have a variety of reasons for why or why they may not. Okay? And these things you can figure out if you understand what the cause of the hypoxia. Don't try to memorize these, but understand what the cause of the hypoxia is, and then this will fall into place. Okay, so work it through and figure out why those are there, and then you won't have to memorize just facts. Okay, you can always come up with why. Anemic hypoxia, not enough red blood cells. We're not doing anything at the gas exchange site. We just don't have enough hemoglobin to carry the oxygen that's already there. So the little hemoglobin that is there is going to be completely saturated because we have more than enough to saturate. We just don't have enough hemoglobin to carry it to the cells. Okay? Can I erase this board now? Okay. So let's finish up by looking at carbon dioxide transport. We're going to deal with this actually a lot more. It will seem that we're spending a very brief time on it right now, but it is the major factor as far as what triggers us to change our respiratory rate. Okay? And so when we come back from spring break, That's what our lecture content is about, is the control of breathing, the control of respiration. And it has to do with carbon dioxide. So it seems that we're spending a very brief time on it here. It's just kind of laying the groundwork for how we'll look at how the carbon dioxide interacts with neurons in the brain. And so we had two mechanisms for the transport of oxygen in the blood. One was dissolved in the plasma as our PO2, and the other was interaction bound to the iron, the heme portion of hemoglobin. All right? We have a similar, but we add a third for the transport of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is dissolved in the blood. It's produced by tissue cells, all right, as part of metabolism. And it's going to diffuse out of the cell and into the capillary blood on its way back to the heart. So what's happening to our venous blood as it moves through the tissues? O2 is going down, PO2 is going down, and PCO2 is going up. And remember we said that carbon dioxide was one of the factors that decreased the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, which makes sense. The more CO2 we have, the more the tissues need the oxygen, all right? So in our blood, we have our red blood cell, and this is affecting PCO2 until it reaches a normal maximum, a normal amount of PCO2 when it gets back to the lungs is equal to about 45 millimeters of mercury. Okay. Some of this is about 7 to 10%, will be dissolved in the blood. All right. About 20 to 25%, you don't need to know those numbers. About 20 to 25% will bind to hemoglobin. But it does not compete with oxygen for iron. It binds to the protein component of the hemoglobin, not the iron atom. But in so doing, it can shift and change the shape of hemoglobin, and we talked about how that makes it more difficult for the oxygen to stay attached to iron. Most of it, about 3/4 of it, 70%, will interact with water and form carbonic acid. Okay, so real straightforward formula. Very easy to balance. So here's the carbon dioxide coming out of the tissues, all right? Some of it will react with water in the plasma. Most of it will react with water in the red blood cell, and that's because the red blood cell contains an enzyme that makes it occur at a faster rate. So as a formula, carbon dioxide, 1 molecule of carbon dioxide plus 1 molecule of water equals carbonic acid. In the red blood cell, there's an enzyme present called carbonic anhydrase that makes this reaction occur faster. Okay? Just like enzymes help our food break down faster. And this is carbonic acid. So most of the carbon dioxide is found in the blood as carbonic acid. What changes pH?
Acidity.
Hydrogen what?
Ions.
Ions. Okay. So if I have 1 molecule of carbonic acid, and I have another bottle that has 10 molecules of carbonic acid in it, which one's going to have a lower pH based on the information I gave you? Okay. So here's 1 molecule of carbonic acid. Here's 10 molecules of carbonic acid. Which one has a lower, more acidic pH? You guys fall for me every time. The same. Do you see any free hydrogen ions? No. So there has to be free hydrogen ions. It means an H with a little plus because it gave up the electron for it to affect pH. When it's bound to the bicarbonate group, it's not going to affect the pH. So this eventually may break down, and these arrows, double-sided arrows, means it's reversible. And this direction is dependent on concentration. So if there's a lot of carbon dioxide and not very many hydrogen ions relative in the solution, then this will be driven to go all the way to the right, okay? If the pH of the blood is very acidic and there is not very many carbon dioxide molecules, then the drive for the equation is to go to the left and make more carbon dioxide, or at least more carbonic acid, okay? So, some of these molecules will dissociate and form a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. Now, we have free hydrogen, okay? So, if I change this situation, and I have 1 free hydrogen, and I have 10 free hydrogens, then yes, that solution on the right would be more acidic. Okay? Now, there's another situation. Hydrochloric acid has a pH of about 1 to 2. Okay? When it dissociates, it releases a free hydrogen ion, 1 hydrogen ion. When carbonic acid dissociates, it also releases 1 hydrogen ion. Hydrochloric acid is considered to be a weak acid. Hydrochloric acid is considered to be a strong acid. Carbonic acid is considered to be a weak acid. But each of them releases a single hydrogen ion. What makes a difference?
How rapidly they will dissociate.
And what is the word for that? Affinity.
It's been a while.
So hydrogen and chloride have a lower affinity for each other. They rapidly dissociate. Bicarbonate ion and hydrogen have a higher affinity. So if I have an ion, I'll have to check with the chemistry professor for the actual numbers. But if I have 100 molecules of hydrochloric acid, I'll probably have about 90, 95 hydrogen ions being released. If I have 100 molecules of carbonic acid, I'll have about 20. That's why it's a weaker acid. Certainly it has the potential, if all of the hydrogen ions dissociated, the pH would be the same. But with that higher affinity, we don't dissociate as many. Okay? So when we get to the end of our urinary system, we'll talk about acid-base balance, and carbonic acid actually is a buffer. So let's say that you have diabetes. You're breaking down fats. Instead of, and this is just an illustration of pH change, you're breaking down fats, which releases fatty acids. So your pH falls. All right? What's going to happen to your respiratory rate as a way of getting rid of those extra hydrogen ions? It's going to increase. Now, you're not actually getting rid of hydrogen ions, but you're getting rid of the carbon dioxide that would interact with the water and make carbonic acid and make hydrogen ions. Okay? So to get rid of the hydrogen ions, you're going to go, you're going to breathe faster. So let's say that you have pneumonia and you have fluid exudate in the alveoli. And therefore, even though carbon dioxide has a higher solubility coefficient and it moves across 20 times faster, it can't cross as often as fast as it used to through that fluid in the alveoli. So it's going to stay when that arterial blood, when the blood leaves the lungs and gets back to the heart, you're going to have a higher PCO2. Instead of PCO2 of 40, which is normal in the blood pumped out of the heart, it might be a PCO2 of 62. What's going to happen to your pH? It's going to go down because you're going to have more carbonic acid, you're going to be releasing more hydrogen ions. Okay? So as we move from respiratory into urinary, we're going to talk about how the body uses the respiratory system as a buffering organ. Unless the problem is a respiratory problem. Okay? And the urinary system is also a buffering organ. So it's one of the reasons I put these two systems together, because they work on that buffering together. Okay? So in the red blood cell, here we have carbon dioxide coming in, binding with water, creating carbonic acid. Some of that will dissociate to form a bicarbonate ion and hydrogen. Hydrogen will bind to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein. Proteins are good buffers. As soon as the hydrogen binds to the hemoglobin, is it going to affect the pH anymore? But it will change the shape of the hemoglobin and make it easier for oxygen to dissociate by lowering the affinity for oxygen. Okay? So here comes off the oxygen and it goes out to the tissues. Now, this is internal respiration. Okay? Oxygen going to the tissues and carbon dioxide coming from the tissues and entering into the blood either to be solubilized or forming carbonic acid. Now, when we change, not when we change, but when the fluid, the plasma gets back to the lungs, and here's our alveolus, the dissolved carbon dioxide that is in the plasma is going to shift to the alveoli because the alveolar PCO2 is only 40. Now that's not nearly the gradient that we had for oxygen, but remember I said that 20 times more CO2 will move across at the same time because of the better solubility. So we don't need a higher gradient since we have better solubility and permeability of CO2. So by the time the blood leaves the lungs, it's going to have an arterial PCO2 equilibrated to that of 40. So as we start to lose carbon dioxide moving out of the plasma, all right, the carbon dioxide that's bound to the hemoglobin will become dissociated and move into the plasma. And the carbonic acid, as there's less and less CO2, will be driven to dissociate and form carbon dioxide and water, and that too will leave the plasma and move into the lungs. So everything that happened this direction in the tissues, now not because of enzymes or because of hormones or nervous system, purely because of a change in the amount of CO2, is going to be driven to go back this direction. Okay? So this direction is tissues. This direction is lung. Unless we're talking about the fetus, and then it would be placenta. Okay, so CO2 combines with water to form carbonic acid in the tissues. When we're in the lungs, carbonic acid dissociates to form CO2 and water, and the CO2 diffuses into the alveoli, and you exhale it. All right, we're done. Party time.
No, it's not.
Away from lessons.
Still have a lab quiz.
Is what?
Still have a lab quiz.
We still have a lab quiz. But before we do the lab quiz, it's somebody's birthday tomorrow.
Oh, thanks.
Just holding it down. I forgot to look at you 5 minutes ago.
It's okay.
So, I didn't realize it was going to be that so soon. So Corey's not going to be around tomorrow, and neither are you. But he's getting red.
Yeah.
So, Lori has hidden some goodies next door, and she's bringing it back. And so you get to add glucose to your brains for the quiz. We're going to break our rules. You're